Okay, so I am going to start the recording right now so you're aware of that. So welcome everyone to our first session in this series of Zoom learnings around interventions. I am Kim Swartz and I work here at AEA 267 and we're really glad that you could be with us today. So we've kind of gone through the recording piece. It is going to be recorded. For the most part, we're going to be seeing Terry's screen, so it's not going to be a problem. But if you do not want to be recorded, please make sure that you turn off your video camera down below. We are going to link this on our website, so it will be public for others to view. So that's why I want you to make sure that you are aware of that. However, we do want you to be able to ask questions, and there are a couple ways that you can ask questions. One is if you have a question, you can unmute your mic, and you can ask a question that way. You can also click down below. There's a chat box you can click on, and you can ask questions through the chat. Joe Kramer is on here with me today, and we are going to be watching that chat box to try to field any questions that might come for our presenters. So with that, I want to let you know that our presenters today are Terry Bosinger, who you're seeing on the screen right now, along with Patty Foster, who's kind of in the background, I think, today. But they are both ELA consultants here at AEA 267, and they are very well versed in interventions. So they're going to be leading us today. Couple other just housekeeping things that I want to let you know. The PowerPoint that they're using today, along with the guidance document for ELI, is in a Google folder that it will be shared with all of you. And in just a little bit, I will put that link into the chat and you'll be able to copy and paste that and hopefully get into that. So I'll do that in a few moments. I'm also going to put the link on where the recorded session will be once we get it up after today's session. So I want you to be aware of that. I'll put all of that in the chat. Just a little background before we get started. Today's session is really going to be around a beginning of interventions to help ground us all in what interventions are and what they're not, and how they complement instruction by being closely tied to authentic tasks and connected text versus kind of skill and drill. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Patty and Terry, and then at the end we'll talk about what our next sessions will be. So Terry, you're on.
Thank you. Hello everyone. We have a lot to cover this afternoon, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. So you'll see the PowerPoint as we go. If you have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box or unmute your microphone and ask. We do have two periods throughout this session where we will stop and ask for questions, ask for clarifications. So if you feel like you want to wait, you can do that. We will certainly have a time to field questions then. So here we go. The goal to play catch-up by teaching a wide array of skills out of authentic reading and writing context might provide short-term gains, but not lasting ones. Students can become skilled, but not strategic or thoughtful about their reading. The rush to teach basic skills minimizes comprehension of complicated text and deep learning of academic content. The intention of MTSS is to intervene on multiple levels, beginning with classroom intervention. Classroom interventions are the first wave of defense. So the focus of this series is to provide information and resources for classroom teachers to utilize. Interventionists such as Title I and special education teachers can also use these strategies because they are the second wave of defense for our students. However, classroom teachers need to provide an intervention before children are evaluated for Title I and special education services. So it is the classroom teacher's responsibility to provide an intervention for students. First of all, any questions or clarifications that you have for us before we start? And I'll wait just a second. All right. Research has found that a lack of proficiency in reading fluency is a factor in a significant percentage of students who experience difficulty in reading. An exclusive or even a primary focus on accurate and automatic word recognition can lead students to a skewed view of what skilled readers do. And that's from Tim Rosinski. It is imperative that we understand the purpose behind FAST assessment and the underlying premise that it is only a screener and not an appropriate diagnostic tool. If we use the FAST screener as a diagnostic assessment, we might inadvertently teach our students to simply say words faster. But this is an incomplete definition of fluency. Fluency is reading at an appropriate rate with accuracy and prosody. Prosody encompasses intonation, phrasing, and expression, and it is the prosodic reading that gives us an indication about whether or not our students understand or comprehend what they're reading. So that intonation and expression tell us whether or not the student is getting the author's message. Given that fluency is an important contributor to comprehension, it is critical that effective instructional approaches are used for its development. Such approaches need to go beyond simply asking students to read text rapidly. They must present learners with a richer and more nuanced understanding of skilled, fluent, and meaning-filled reading. And that's also from Tim Rosinski. When students read with prosody and not just speed, they show us that they know when an author is asking a question because the student's voice rises near the end of a sentence. The students also show us that they know when a character is angry because they read in a louder, stronger voice. We can learn a lot from a student when we listen to him read. The FAST screener is the first step in identifying that a student is a struggling reader. And I like this representation of the MTSS triangle because there are shades of green, yellow, and red. As you move up the triangle, we have fewer students receiving more intensive instruction. But notice the cycle in the center. As teachers, we are constantly analyzing student data, implementing additional supportive instruction for struggling readers, and evaluating the effectiveness of the more intensive instruction. So layers are added for those who need additional supports. We start in the classroom and move to more intensive instruction. When using a screener such as the FAST assessment, we are able to monitor the effectiveness of our core instruction and identify high-performing students as well as low-performing students who might need additional diagnostic assessments. If a student is found to be lagging behind his peers in literacy growth, then further diagnostic assessment is used to determine the areas of weakness so that the teacher can deliver targeted small group instruction to quickly close the achievement gap. We can't forget the high achieving students in this process as well. Iowa Code 279.68 helps establish intensive accelerated reading instruction to each kindergarten through third grade student who is assessed and exhibiting a substantial deficiency in reading. That comes right from the Iowa Code. The code mandates DE-approved universal screening in reading for students in kindergarten through third grade. It mandates progress monitoring for students who are labeled at risk or exhibit a substantial deficiency in reading. It mandates additional intensive instruction plus 90 minutes of daily research-based reading instruction. So for students who exhibit a substantial reading deficiency in the areas of phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and or comprehension, an intensive intervention must be implemented. That was a lot of alliteration there. It also mandates we notify parents that a student exhibits a substantial deficiency in reading, including strategies the parents can use at home to help the child succeed. So right now we'll stop and wait for just a few minutes. Any questions you have so far? And you might think about some of the questions you see on the screen. What information from the presentation has been helpful so far? What is something that from this presentation that is different from your previous thinking? So I'll wait just a few minutes here.
Terry, just while people are thinking, I'm going to just throw in a little plug here. One of the things you said is that the letters need to share information around strategies or things that parents can do at home. So if you've not yet gone to the Iowa Reading Research Center website, you might want to do that. You can just Google Iowa Reading Research Center, and they actually have information there about resources that families can use with their children. So that might be something you want to take a look at as a teacher to share with parents.
Thank you. And this is a contract. Joe, could you talk for a second about the contract between parents and students and teachers?
Well, the contract is intended to, I think, make sure that the communication between school and parents regarding what the school is intended to do, but also place some responsibility on future efforts on the laps of the student and the parent. So I think it's communication is vitally important when we're dealing with kids who are at risk, and this just helps formalize this process a little bit more.
Okay.
And again, there are some samples of contracts that have been available, that are available on the DE website, on the Eli site, and perhaps even the Iowa Reading Research Center.
Thank you. Okay, we'll keep going. Interventions are direct, explicit, and systematic, targeted, and intensive instructional processes that either extend or enhance instruction. Interventions are designed to meet the identified needs of an individual or groups of individuals and are monitored on a regular and frequent basis. An intervention is targeted one-to-one or small group instruction, and this time can be used to accelerate and enrich literacy instruction for students who are performing either very well in reading or struggling in reading, and is a time for classroom teachers to provide intensive instruction for struggling readers who are below the established FAST benchmarks. An intervention is anything a school does above and beyond what all students receive that helps a child succeed in school. This additional support can be a practice, a strategy, or a program. Notice the words above and beyond what all students receive. An intervention is layered on top of what all students receive in the classroom already. Evidence-based instruction involves teachers making decisions using professional wisdom integrated with research-based best practices, and that's from Richard Allington. So we use our professional wisdom along with research-based best practices to make good decisions about interventions for students. Interventions must be designed to match the needs of the student. And this is where a diagnostic assessment is crucial, because we must identify what the student needs in order for the intervention to be successful. So number 3, delivered by trained professionals and implemented with fidelity. While it's best practice to have the most skilled certified teachers with the most training on a particular intervention or type of instruction working with the most needy students, we do understand the important contributions that classified staffs or paraprofessionals make in our schools in meeting the needs of students. So given the current climate regarding the availability of resources, it would be appropriate in some situations for classified staff who have received training in an intervention to deliver that intervention. However, this does not mean that classified staff would be the ones developing the intervention so they match the student's needs, nor making changes to the intervention based on the collected data. This continues to be the job of the certified teacher. If the student is making gains, continue with the intervention. But if you see after about 6 or 7 weeks that a student is not making gains, you should make changes to the current instructional approach. All students who are deemed substantially deficient in reading must receive an intervention. It is not optional. And all students must receive core instruction and an intervention or anything else they need. They can't be removed from the universal core to receive their intervention. So then, what are interventions? When we think about interventions, we think about reducing the size of the group, increasing the frequency of the instructional session, giving students more opportunities to respond to teacher questioning, increasing the quality and quantity of teacher feedback, increasing the duration of small group instruction, differentiating the materials given to students, and focusing the number of standards being addressed in a lesson. These things are variables and they can change based on the needs of the students. An intervention is not using only accommodations like preferential seating or modifications like changing performance expectations like shortening a spelling list without any direct teaching. They also are not study hall or voluntary before and after school tutoring. In fact, Iowa Code says that the intervention must be delivered during regular school hours. And an intervention is not Title I or special education in and of itself. Title I and special education are great delivery vehicles, but not necessarily an intervention. So when thinking about an intervention, we can't simply provide accommodations. We must provide additional explicit small group instruction or one-to-one conferring with students. So at the end of the day, we want to close the achievement gap and to assure high levels of learning for all students. Our goal is to extend the learning of high-achieving students and close the achievement gap for struggling readers. If a student is already receiving additional instruction in Title I groups or special education, or we have already tried an intervention and the student continues to lag behind, we must change things up. We do need at least 6 data points, hopefully they're a week apart, in order to determine whether or not students' interventions are working. But if the data suggests that students are not making gains, we need to consider something different for the student. So no matter how great the idea or compelling the research, if an intervention or instructional approach is not working, something needs to change.
So Terry, can I interrupt for a minute here?
Sure.
I'm wondering, so you talked about the 6 data points, and I don't know, maybe Joe, if you could just talk a little bit about this, or Terry, either one, but can you describe a little bit more about what you're talking about there, what that might mean?
Sure. I think Joe has a great explanation of 6 data points.
Well, I've kind of defaulted to what we teach here at AEA 267 in progress monitoring. So those of you listening, and this is not anything that has yet come out from the DE. It is hopeful that in the very near future that the Iowa tier will help practitioners wade through how many data points and whatnot. But the one thing is we need to have enough data points so that we can start looking at trend information. And we also need to have enough instruction or additional or different instruction take place before we can start gauging whether our instructional efforts are useful. Some of what we read is that best practice would suggest that we have at minimally 6 weeks of instruction and minimally 6 data points before we start looking at the effectiveness of an intervention. And so once those 2 criteria have been satisfied, you can look at the last 4 pieces of data, and if they're all above the aim line, thumbs up, celebrate. Good things are happening for that student. And if the last 4 data points are below, perhaps we need to think about doing something different, or as Terry said, change things up. If the data really isn't showing a definite trend, some above, some below, keep doing what we're doing and see what the future data tells us. I suspect additional guidance, specific guidance, will be coming from the DE regarding this.
Thank you. So right now we're going to stop again for additional questions, clarifications. Think about the two questions you see on the screen. Are you disappointed to learn that there's no magic pill when it comes to applying interventions based on student needs? How do you feel knowing that an intervention is anything a school does above and beyond what all students receive that helps a child succeed in school? So think about those for a second, and we'll stop for questions for a minute.
Just a reminder, if you don't want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute and ask.
Terry, could you make a clarification on that it is in addition to? So let's say in the regular school day, there's a reading block that includes 40 minutes of independent reading. And so students are reading independently. During that time, if the teacher gives additional small group instruction to a targeted group, is that above and beyond, or is that not above and beyond?
That is not above and beyond. First of all, the Iowa Code states that students who are substantially deficient must receive 90 minutes of core instruction. So for a student to receive 40 minutes of core instruction, that student would need an additional 50 minutes of core instruction and then an intervention laid on top of that. So, and we have to remember that universal core instruction should include small group learning for all students. So we have to remember that an intervention is something you would do beyond what all students would receive. So they would need an additional small group or one-to-one instructional piece in order for that to be considered an intervention. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So we have a question through the chat that I will read, and anyone who wants to pick it up and answer it, go ahead. The question is, if the FAST assessment is meant to be diagnostic and help me determine the intervention, how do I determine that intervention from a simple word per minute number?
You want to take that?
I'll help you. I'll take that one. The FAST assessment is not meant to be diagnostic. The FAST assessment is simply a screener that tells you that this student is struggling in some way in reading. It doesn't define how they're struggling. So in order to define how that student is struggling, an additional diagnostic assessment needs to be given to the student. So the words per minute, a simple number, doesn't give you enough information to supply an intervention to that student. You need to give additional assessment.
So if you have additional questions from that, go ahead and add to that.
Terry, how does A reading fall into that as well?
Joe, do you want to talk about A reading?
Again, A Reading's primary function is to be a universal screening tool. So again, kind of to piggyback on my response earlier, a tool to be able to identify who is at risk for future reading difficulties and who are not. Now, granted, A Reading taps into a broader range of reading skills, but currently the score that we would receive from FAST on Iowa Tier does not disaggregate the data in any way to provide insight into which of those sub-skills are stronger or not. So currently, A Reading is purely another universal screening tool.
So another question to kind of follow up with that is, what are the additional assessments used for diagnostic purposes?
There are many diagnostic assessments in reading. And do we want to name names of diagnostic assessments, or do we want to? Yes? Okay. So, for instance, in my classroom a few years ago, I used a diagnostic assessment from Fountas and Pinnell called Benchmark Assessment. Patty in her Waterloo schools used the DRA-2 as a diagnostic assessment. There is BRI could be considered a diagnostic assessment, I suppose, but it's got limited capabilities. Joe, jump in anytime you can think of others.
Terry, wouldn't running records be a diagnostic
Yes,
assessment?
thank you. Running records are a great diagnostic assessment.
And at a kindergarten level, the observation survey would be a diagnostic assessment?
Yes, thank you. And Joe says the state has recently commissioned a task team charged with identifying diagnostic tools that can be used. Thanks, Joe. So FAST doesn't give you enough information to supply an intervention to a student. You have to use an additional tool.
So I'm going to go on to another question. So this question is, could you define making gains? During an intervention, students show gains, but not enough to close gaps. You said you just keep going with the intervention. If it's not enough to close gaps, shouldn't something change?
It depends on what closing the gaps mean and how strong the gain is. If the student is just making gains like another student without an intervention is making gains, just kind of keeping up with the benchmark. As the benchmark goes up, the student travels at the same rate, then yes, I think it's time to change the intervention. But if the student is progressing faster than other students in the classroom and closing the gap a little, then you could probably continue with that intervention for a longer period of time. Joe, do you agree with that?
Yeah, the aim line that we're always looking at would be that level that the student needs to be at the end of the school year. So we might find that a student has grown leaps and bounds. I mean, just really set the world on fire with their growth. But let's pretend the winter assessment period comes, and that even though the great growth still, they demonstrate below winter benchmarks, that student is still at risk, and we would still want to keep our eyes on that student, continue to provide interventions. But as Terry mentioned, if the trend is steeper than the aim line, and I don't need to get too deep into this, keep using that intervention, because they will catch up if that trend line continues at the same pace.
Another question, I think it looks like, could you clarify again the number of minutes needed for an intervention beyond the 90 minutes of core instruction? And the state doesn't determine the number of minutes needed for an intervention. So if the student is making gains with a 15 to 20 minute intervention, then you should continue the 15 to 20 minute intervention. If more time is needed for that student, you should give them as much time as you possibly can. But the state does not clarify the number of minutes needed for an intervention.
So another question, is it appropriate to use teacher wisdom and classroom work performance rather than test again? And I'm not sure that I understand the question about rather than test again, whether that means the screener again or a diagnostic assessment. I'm not sure. Maybe Joe and Terry, you do, but if not, okay, so diagnostic testing to define the problem. So is it appropriate to use teacher wisdom and classroom work performance rather than diagnostic testing?
I think it takes a diagnostic assessment to really learn and understand what the weaknesses of the child are. I think a teacher could guess and take a stab at it, but I'm not sure that they would get the quality information needed to move the student along quickly enough to close the gap with just a guess.
Yeah, I would add that when the state pushes out some information regarding diagnostic, and I'm going to use this term intentionally, process, is that they're not going to talk about it as being a test per se. You can collect good functional information regarding kids' strengths and weaknesses, certainly using a test off the shelf. So I'm not trying to say that you can't use that. But I would also argue if teachers are currently using good embedded activities to elicit evidence of student learning that are embedded in the Iowa core and they have a lot of rich information, then really their opinion, I guess, of the students' needs are well grounded in a lot of data. And really that's good functional assessment that happens day in and day out. So I think we need to leverage all the tools that we have available to help identify strengths and weaknesses to inform what the student needs.
So one more question here, and I think it's kind of goes along with what you've already been talking about. Since 2 through 6th grades are screened for fluency, what would you recommend using as an intervention if the screener is essentially a measure of speed and accuracy? Teachers are concerned that the screener is not an accurate measure of what students need to be able to do with reading example comprehension.
Right. And again, it's just a screener to identify that this student is struggling in some way. So an additional diagnostic assessment is needed to gain that clarity in what the student is deficient in. So fluency is an outcome. A highly fluent reader is the outcome of quality reading, of strong reading foundation in the student. So we want to make sure that we are assessing what the student actually needs to become a fluent reader. And so the FAST test is measuring the outcome. What the diagnostic test will do is measure what the student is deficient in.
Okay, additional question. What do students miss in the general education classroom to have intervention time?
Well, they have to miss something, but the classroom teacher will be providing this first layer of intervention to the students. So it does have to come at some point during the day. That doesn't mean the students need to miss instruction, but when the students are working during independent writing time or independent language time or some other time during the day, the teacher can be supplying an intervention at that time. It needs to be done outside of core instruction time.
And Terry, couldn't that time vary so that the student doesn't miss the same thing every time that the intervention is used?
Yes. If the student has to be, if the Title I teacher or the special education teacher has to deliver the intervention because the classroom intervention has now not been successful and we're moving up the tier, then one possible solution is to rotate the time that the student leaves the classroom during the day. And I know that that's a scheduling nightmare, and I know we have to be creative with our scheduling, but we do want to make it so that the children do not miss the same instructional content every single day.
This is Justin in Grinnell, and I know just to add into this comment, in Grinnell, we actually went to a building-wide intervention. We're tapping into all student learning, high and low achieving students. And that seemed to help with some of our issue with the kids missing certain classes. And, you know, it really is a scheduling nightmare. But we did go to a building-wide intervention time, which we call Radar, and it's been tremendous. We've had great success with it. So something some of you might want to consider.
Thank you. I have heard of many schools who are going to that building-wide intervention time.
I think that's it, Terry. Those are all the
All
questions.
right. We'll keep going. So I want to talk for just a few minutes about a balanced literacy framework. We consider this universal core instruction, and I want to talk about the ELI legislation because ELI legislation mandates that all substantially deficient children receive 90 minutes of daily reading instruction that's research-based, and then an additional intervention time. So many teachers have asked me the question, what goes on during that 90-minute reading block? So this is just one version of a balanced literacy framework. This does have a 90-minute reading block. There are many versions of balanced literacy frameworks that are out there, but some of the components inside the reading block are comprehension strategy mini lessons that are taught contextually using the gradual release of responsibility method of instruction. Students are given substantial amount of time to engage in meaningful practice and application of the reading strategy. Differentiated support is given through prompting and coaching from the teacher. Students are given opportunities to have rich discussions about rigorous and engaging text. There is varied and vast reading both on the student's reading level and above the student's reading level that occur using complex and rigorous texts. Students work in large group sessions, small group sessions, and individually with the teacher for differentiated instruction using the gradual release of responsibility model. So this is simply one framework. There are many others to consider when thinking about universal core instruction. And we can't forget that formal and informal assessments are constantly occurring during all of the instructional cycles, whole group, small group, and individual learning times. So this is assessment is a big piece of the puzzle here, and we must continually assess our students to understand their needs as learners. When teachers know their students well, they will be more successful with the implementation of core instruction and interventions. So there are more diagnostic assessments available for teachers to use, and we just talked about those, and Joe's going to talk some more about those on during the March 31st session. We use running records to inform our instruction. A lot of our reading instruction can be informed by running records. And one of the most important things to remember is that we have data to support the instructional decisions we make for our students. The data might be anecdotal or it might be formal. Again, thinking about instructional approaches for both universal core instruction and intensive interventions, we must provide for our students rich context for learning and provide a content focus for identifying and resolving real-world problems. In other words, the instruction should be meaningful and engaging to students. Students might collaborate with their peers to solve problems. They might think analytically as they participate in inquiry-based learning. Mentor texts provide an anchor for a prolonged unit of study. They're complex, and the content will help advance critical thinking skills of students. They'll also provide a foundation for the new learning, so it anchors their learning. Resources should include a wide variety of texts, and teachers must provide students ample time to engage in authentic tasks using those texts. Teachers will utilize multiple frameworks for instruction. Again, we'll use large group, small group, and one-to-one conferring with students. So we must provide explicit instruction for our students. Additional small group instruction will help students acquire and apply skills needed to be successful in reading. Skill and strategy lessons should address all areas of literacy development. And guided reading or small group instruction will help students learn from more challenging texts with scaffolded support from the teacher. Students should not be confined to learning reading and writing skills and strategies during a reading block. We need to provide ample opportunities for students to engage in challenging reading and writing tasks outside of their daily reading block. So you might consider teaching skills and strategies that are embedded in continuous text. This encourages the learning of several skills and strategies at the same time and makes the learning seem more seamless. So struggling readers have a long history of being held in place with limited achievement gains because they receive instruction with texts that are too easy and not rich and complex. Struggling readers also need opportunities to engage in authentic reading tasks from multiple text levels and engage in critical analysis of those texts. We can't hold kids back by having them immersed in readers that are far too easy and not complex enough for them.
So Terry, I'm just sitting here thinking, okay, so how do you do that when they're struggling and yet they need to be in complex text? How does that work?
That works by providing scaffolding from the teacher. And so when you think about a guided reading group, you think about teaching a group of students in a book that's just a bit too hard for them to handle on their own. But when providing scaffolding from the teacher, so coaching and support and prompting from the teacher, they can achieve at higher levels. And they need to know how that feels to be in those complex, rich texts so that they know what it means to think critically and comprehend text. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So the big five, we're focusing our instruction on phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, comprehension, and vocabulary based on the recommendations of the National Reading Panel and the Iowa Department of Education. Our next Zoom meetings will focus on these areas with a meeting on assessment at the end of the series. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to kind of go over the big five and talk about those, but then know that you'll get much more information on each of these in the series, in the Zoom meetings that are coming up. Many teachers use the words phonological awareness and phonemic awareness synonymously, but they're not the same. Phonological awareness is a student's familiarity with words, rhyming words, onsets, rhymes, syllables, and individual sounds. Phonemic awareness is the ability to focus on and manipulate those individual sounds in spoken words. And phonics is the knowledge of letter-sound relationships and how they're used in reading and writing. So phonological awareness and phonemic awareness focus on the spoken word, and phonics focuses on the written word. So let's take a second to familiarize ourselves with some of the terms associated with phonemic awareness. Phoneme isolation means that we're focusing on individual sounds in words. Phoneme identity means the common sound in different words. Phoneme blending is listening to a sequence of separately spoken words and combining them to form a recognizable word. Phoneme segmentation means breaking words into sounds, and phoneme deletion is what remains when a specified phoneme is removed. And again, we'll talk more about that in our phonemic awareness presentation next week. Where phonological and phonemic awareness focus on the spoken word, phonics focuses on the written word, both reading and writing. So phonics instruction is a planned sequential set of phonic elements taught explicitly and systematically. The goal of all phonics programs is to enable learners to acquire sufficient knowledge and use the alphabetic code so that they can make normal progress in learning to read and comprehend written language. Explicit and implicit vocabulary instruction are crucial factors in reading instruction. The Iowa Department of Education defines vocabulary like this. Vocabulary is defined as the words we must know to communicate effectively. It can be described as oral vocabulary or reading vocabulary. Oral vocabulary refers to words that we use in speaking or recognize in listening. Reading refers to words we recognize or use in print. Vocabulary is used to make sense of words in print. It is also very important to reading comprehension. Readers cannot understand what they are reading without knowing what most of the words mean. Fluent readers can read text with speed, accuracy, and prosody. Fluency depends upon well-developed word recognition skills, but such skills do not inevitably lead to fluency. It is generally acknowledged that fluency is a critical component of skilled reading. Fluency must be taught, but we must be mindful when teaching it. We cannot simply place our children in front of text and say to them, "Read just a little bit faster, please." In fact, just teaching kids to read fast is detrimental to students' ability to comprehend. So fluent readers are often the outcome of strong literacy instruction. Reading comprehension is defined as intentional thinking during which meaning is constructed through interactions between the text and the reader. According to this view, meaning resides in the intentional problem-solving thinking processes of the reader that occur during an interaction with a text. Reading comprehension is always the goal of reading instruction. Go ahead, Kim.
That was a lot of information. I wonder if we need to stop for any questions at this point.
Okay, we can. It was a lot of information. And know that there's more to come. That's just a little sampling of what's coming up.
Not seeing any questions.
All right. So some final thoughts for our session today. Here we go. Interventions do not replace quality core instruction. We cannot intervene our way out of a core instruction problem. Interventions are grounded in the Iowa Core, Iowa Early Learning Standards, and should be closely tied to authentic tasks and connected text. Student data, which is universal screening, diagnostic assessments, classroom and progress monitoring data, inform the intervention development and implementation.
So Terry, if we can go back up to that first bullet. So this is the first testing period where we have students that we have to do interventions with. And while we need to do that and place an emphasis on that, we also have to remember that if we have less than 80% of our students that are meeting benchmarks, then we really do need to think about the core instruction that's happening within the classroom. So it's a balancing act right now, and it can seem a little bit overwhelming, but if we can get that core instruction in place, hopefully we're going to have less and less students that need those interventions. So we need to be working on both levels.
Right.
And that's really something that last year, our initial phase 1 multi-tiered system of support schools, that's really the work that they did last year, was to try to get that core in place. And they kept saying, where are the interventions? Give us a list of interventions. But this year they're saying, thanks for not working on interventions, because it caused us to look at our core instruction and to really look at what was happening there. So kind of keep those things in mind as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing that teachers are overwhelmed because they're intervening with half of their class. And so knowing that, we need to know that the Iowa Core is rigorous, They're rigorous standards, and we have to understand that our core instruction has to be bolstered in order to get that 80%, to get our 80% of students proficient in the core. So you're right, it's a balancing act and it's difficult. There are no silver bullets. If there was a silver bullet program available, we'd all be using it for all of the universal core instruction. And so here it is in red. There is no state list of required interventions. We have to be kid watchers. We have to give diagnostic assessments, and we have to know what our kids need and deliver intervention based on their needs.
And I know that there's been a lot of people that have emailed and said, when will the state be sending out a list of interventions? Or AEA, will you give us a list of interventions? And you know, that's not going to happen, but that's why we wanted to have these series of sessions around, here are some instructional strategies that you might use and think about as interventions.
I'm going to add that there will not be a list of required interventions, but again, like many task groups around the state, they are continuing to look at whether it's programs or more specifically routines and strategies that can be used as options for schools. So they're really trying to help support intervention efforts, but there's not going to be a list that says these are the only ones you can use, and if you're not using them, you're in trouble.
So according to Mike Matos, ultimately there's no intervention in a box that can beat a highly effective teacher working with a targeted group of students. A school will get much better results if it spends less time searching for the Holy Grail and more time working in collaborative teacher teams to find the most effective teaching practices for its students. So, we've come to the end. Here's your opportunity to ask more questions. You could think about these 2 questions on the screen. After hearing all of this information today, what makes you nervous about delivering interventions? And what would you like to know more about? And we'll ponder those for a little bit and hopefully answer all your questions.
I think this is a good opportunity too as you think about the upcoming sessions. So what are some things that you'd like to know more about? Because we will certainly try to answer any of those questions that we can as we move forward with these Zoom sessions. So I'm not seeing any questions nor hearing anyone jump in. So I'm going to go ahead and end this session in just a few moments. But I do want to take an opportunity to thank you for being here this afternoon. I do want to let you know that we are going to post this video on our website, and I'm going to put that in the chat box right now. So this is a page that we have created for these, and you'll be able to link on there. And as soon as they're in, we'll try to get them posted. I'm going to try to get that done by tomorrow, but if not tomorrow, by Monday. Also, I shared earlier that there is a Google folder that has all the documents. So the PowerPoint, the guidance document is in the folder for today for your use. You can use this with other staff. Next Thursday, February 19th, we are going to get specific into interventions for phonemic awareness. So we hope that you will be able to join us for that. So we're going to stay on just a couple minutes more if there's any other questions. Again, thanks for coming. All right. Thanks, everybody.